A 1-hour talk on the distance between the money in your head and the money in your hand. There is a sentence a person can say in about 10 seconds. It is not clever. It will not impress anyone at a dinner party. And it is, as far as I can tell, the single most expensive sentence in the English language. Expensive in the sense that almost nobody is willing to pay what it costs to actually mean it. I want to earn the right to give it to you, so I'm not going to hand it over in the first minute. If I do, you'll nod, file it under things I already knew, and go back to scrolling. So let's take the long way there. Here is where I'll start. Every dollar that has ever existed has existed twice. The first time, it exists inside a skull, weightless, invisible, worth exactly nothing to anyone, including the person carrying it. The second time, it exists in the world, countable, spendable, capable of paying rent or a hospital bill or tuition for a kid whose parents never got the chance to finish school themselves. Between those two versions of the same dollar sits a wall. Most people spend their whole lives on the wrong side of it, and they usually don't know the wall is even there. Nothing has ever entered the physical world without first being assembled somewhere invisible. Every building was a picture in someone's head before it was a foundation. Every company that now employs your neighbors was, at some point, a stranger's private daydream while he rode the bus to a job that paid him to think about something else entirely. That part isn't controversial. Most people have already heard some version of everything starts as an idea. What almost nobody tells you is the part that comes after, because the part that comes after is inconvenient. You are not short on ideas. I'd bet money on that, and I don't know you. Almost nobody who's ever watched one of these videos is short on ideas. You've built entire businesses in your head at 1 a.m. You've designed the shop, picked the sign, imagined the opening day, done rough math on the margins, and fallen asleep pleased with yourself. And every one of those ideas is still exactly where you left it. Worth nothing. Because an idea that lives only in your head is not wealth. It's entertainment. It's a very expensive form of entertainment because it feels like progress while costing you nothing and producing nothing. So if the idea isn't the missing piece, and it isn't, what is? Let me tell a story that gets told badly most of the time. So let me try to tell it right. In the early 20th century, a traveling salesman kept turning over a simple, almost silly idea. What if a razor blade were made so thin and so cheap that a man would use it a few times and simply throw it away, rather than spending 20 minutes each morning stropping a blade that was meant to last decades? He took the idea to metallurgists. They told him, patiently at first and less patiently later, that steel could not be manufactured that thin and that cheap and still hold an edge, that he didn't understand the trade, and that he was wasting the time of serious men. He heard some version of that rejection for years, not weeks. His own money went into the effort and came back out as nothing more than once. That man's name was King Camp Gillette, and there's a decent chance the blade you shaved with this week is a great-grandchild of his stubbornness. Here's the point that usually gets missed. Gillette was almost certainly not the only person who ever had that idea. A disposable blade is not a stroke of genius. Plenty of metalworkers could have thought of it on a slow afternoon. What made Gillette different wasn't the idea. It was that he was the one person willing to ask what the idea would cost him, and then actually pay it, in money, in years, in public ridicule, from people whose opinion he'd once valued. The idea was free. Everyone had access to it. The price was not free, and almost nobody was willing to pay it. That's the whole story, really. Everything else is detail. Now let's talk about the version of this you've probably lived, because I suspect you have. Somewhere out there is a person with a genuinely workable plan. Not a fantasy, an actual plan that could make them real money, and they will bury it without a funeral. If you ask why, they'll give you a long list. Bad timing, no capital, the economy, the kids, the mortgage. Not one item on that list is the real reason. The real reason is that they can already hear the laughter. They can hear the brother-in-law's comment at Thanksgiving. They can hear the coworker who has never finished anything in his life, but who somehow always has an opinion about other people's ambitions, and who needs you to fail, quietly, because your success would be evidence that the thing was possible after all, and he can't afford that evidence. So the plan goes into a drawer. 2 years later, someone else builds the very thing that was buried. And the person who buried it reads about it in the news and says, to no one in particular, I thought of that. Yes, you thought of it. A buried idea is worth exactly what a seed is worth locked in a safe, which is to say, nothing, regardless of how good the seed is. So here is the wall, precisely located. Invisible money becomes real money at exactly one moment, and it is never the moment you have the idea, and never the moment you get excited about it, and never the moment you describe it enthusiastically to your spouse over dinner. It is the moment you stop admiring the idea and ask plainly what it will cost you. That's the first piece of the sentence I promised you. Not what will I get, what will I give in return? There is no such thing as something for nothing, anywhere, ever. A person who wants wealth without rendering value isn't running a business. He's just a thief who hasn't been caught yet. Before we go further, I want to step outside the lecture for a second and just talk to you directly. If you've made it this far, thank you, genuinely. There's an entire industry built around stealing your attention in 6-second increments, and you chose to sit with something longer than that. That's worth acknowledging. If, later on, you want a simple written exercise to put tonight's idea into practice, I'll leave a link in the description. It won't make you rich by itself. Nothing free ever does, but it's a place to start writing the sentence down in your own words. What you do with it after that is entirely up to you. Now back to it, because the hardest part is still ahead. This is the part of the philosophy I find hardest to soften, so I'm not going to try. You do not pay the price after the money shows up. You pay it before, with no receipt, no guarantee, and usually no witness. People ask why the order can't be reversed, why you can't render the service after you've been paid, or at least promised payment. The answer is mechanical, not moral. If payment came at the same moment as the giving, it wouldn't be an investment of faith. It would just be a transaction, and transactions don't move anyone. The entire force of the exchange comes from the fact that it couldn't possibly be repaid on the spot, and the other party knows that, and that knowledge is exactly what makes them remember you. There's an old shorthand for this that fits on an index card: quality, quantity, and spirit. Quality, how carefully you do the work. Quantity, how much of it you're willing to do. Almost anyone can improve those two with enough discipline. But it's the third one, spirit, that people actually get remembered and paid for. And it's the one almost nobody manages, because it can't be faked convincingly for long. Two people can produce identical work at an identical hour to an identical standard, and one of them gets promoted while the other spends the next decade telling his wife the world is unfair. The world isn't unfair. The world felt the difference. One of them did the work like a debt being grudgingly repaid. The other did it as a statement about the kind of person he'd decided to be. Nobody could tell you exactly how they knew which was which, but everyone always knows. There was a man who bought a struggling clothing company from an owner notorious for long hours and brutal wages. A reputation so bad, the new owner was almost embarrassed to put his name on the building. He'd believed in the golden rule his whole life, the way most of us do, sincerely, on Sundays, and nowhere near the workplace on Mondays, because everyone knows you can't run a business that way. One day, standing on the factory floor looking at his own employees, something bothered him that he couldn't shake. He had believed a principle his entire life and never once tested it anywhere it might actually cost him something. So he called everyone together, told them honestly that the business was nearly bankrupt, and announced he was going to run the company by that rule from that day forward, treating every person there as he'd want to be treated in their position. Then, with the company on the edge of failure, he raised their wages. Every experienced business person who heard about it thought he'd lost his mind. Instead, the company didn't just recover. It grew at a pace nobody could explain from the books alone, because the thing driving the growth wasn't in the ledger. It was in how people cut cloth when no one was supervising them. It was in the extra care taken on a seam at 4 o'clock on a Friday by someone who'd started sewing it like it was his own coat. The part that matters most in that story is easy to miss. He didn't do it as a calculated strategy. If he'd raised those wages while privately running the numbers on how it would pay off within a year, it would have failed, and it would have deserved to. People can tell the difference between generosity and a spreadsheet wearing a generous costume almost every time. Now, the more common version, the one I suspect most of us have lived through at some point. There's a person who does exactly what's asked of them, not less. They show up on time, leave on time, and do competent, adequate work. If you asked them, they'd tell you, with real conviction, that they're a good, honest employee, and they'd be right. And they'll likely retire from the same desk because they've struck a quiet bargain with life. I will give exactly what's required, and life will give me exactly what was promised. And life, which is scrupulously fair and entirely without sentiment, honors that bargain to the letter. They get the wage, always the wage, never one thing more, because they've never once given one thing more. They watch others get promoted past them for 30 years and call it politics or favoritism. It's neither. It's that nobody has ever felt anything extra coming off their work. Here's the uncomfortable truth underneath all of this. Paying a price before the return is visible isn't really a business technique. It's closer to faith, the costly kind, not the kind people carry into a building once a week and leave there. Faith with money and time actually attached to it, paid in advance, with the proof arriving only afterward, and only for the person who moved before they had proof. There's an old story about two prospectors during a gold rush. An uncle and nephew who staked a claim, found real ore, mortgaged everything they had for machinery, and hit a vein rich enough to make headlines. Then the vein simply stopped. They drilled further. They followed where the seam should have continued. Nothing. After weeks of this, they gave up, sold the equipment to a scrap dealer for a fraction of its value, and went home. The scrap dealer did one thing they hadn't thought to do. He brought in a mining engineer. The engineer studied the geology and told him the vein hadn't disappeared. It had simply been offset by a fault line, and the ore would very likely resume about 3 feet from where the drilling had stopped. 3 feet. The scrap dealer made a fortune from that hole. This was never really a story about mining. The original prospectors didn't lack faith at the start. They mortgaged their futures on faith, hauled machinery over mountains on faith, believed completely. They lost it at the end. And faith at the beginning, it turns out, is worth almost nothing on its own, because everyone starts with it. Every failed venture you've ever heard of began with genuine, burning conviction. Faith only gets tested in the last 3 feet, not when things are going well, not when people are cheering you on, but in the dark, with the money gone, and every sensible person telling you to come home. That's precisely where most people set down their tools. Effort like this doesn't pay out in installments. You go the extra distance and nothing visible happens. You go again and still nothing. So the return home starts to look reasonable, even wise. But when the payoff finally comes, it tends to arrive all at once, and almost always from a direction nobody was watching. Not from the supervisor you were trying to impress, but from someone in another department who noticed you on a day you don't even remember. So that's the second piece of the sentence. And how much? A price that isn't actually measured isn't a price. It's just a nice intention, and intentions don't compound. Now the final piece, and honestly the one that does most of the actual work, a price with no deadline attached to it, is a daydream wearing a business suit. Plenty of people fully intend to pay the price someday. They mean it sincerely, sometimes for decades. They're going to start in the spring. They're going to start when the kids are older, when they feel ready. Ready is a feeling some people wait their entire lives to arrive at, and it simply doesn't, and the plan stays exactly where they left it. Here's an idea worth sitting with. The failure of ambition and the failure of prayer often look identical from the outside. Both are the failure of someone who says, "Please help me," and can't finish the sentence. Help with what, specifically? How much, specifically? By when? In exchange for what? Most people asking for help have never actually answered those questions. Not once, not in 30 years. And then they conclude the universe simply isn't listening. The universe usually isn't deaf. It's just extremely literal, and it tends to hand people back exactly what they asked for, which is often nothing in particular. There's a well-known story about a young minister who wanted to found a college, not a generic one, but a specific kind of institution built around a specific idea of education. He'd carried the plan for years. He'd prayed about it sincerely, more times than he could count, and received nothing back. No funding, no lead, no sign. He needed roughly $1 million, which in his time and place was an almost unthinkable sum for a man with no wealthy connections. One Saturday, sitting in his study, he did something he'd never done before. He stopped wanting the money and decided specifically to have it within 1 week. Notice what actually changed in that room. Nothing, materially. He had no more money on Saturday than he'd had on Friday. No new idea, no wealthy relative had suddenly appeared. What changed was that a vague wish became a definite decision with a deadline attached. That was the entire shift, and it turned out to be enough. He wrote a sermon describing in detail exactly what he'd build if he had the money, not as a plea, but as a description of something he could already see finished. He delivered it the next morning. When he was done, a man stood up in the congregation, walked the length of the aisle, shook his hand, and told him to come by his office the next day for the funds. The institution that man founded still exists. And the detail worth sitting with is this. He'd been praying for that money for years while it sat, quite literally, a few dozen feet away from him every single Sunday. He'd looked toward that pew for years and never once asked directly. One more story, briefly. A young man once arrived at a famous inventor's laboratory, having ridden much of the way there on a freight train, dressed like exactly what he was, broke. Hundreds of people came through that lab asking for a job, and every one of them who asked for a job got one, at a workman's wage, and many of them stayed at that wage for the rest of their working lives. This particular young man didn't ask for a job. He asked to become the inventor's business partner. Before long, he held the exclusive distribution rights to one of the inventor's major products and became a wealthy man in his own right. He got exactly what he asked for. So notably, did everyone else in that room. That has always been the actual mechanism. None of this works if you think the thought once, feel moved by it tonight, and are entirely back to normal by Thursday. That happens to almost everyone the first time, and it will probably happen to you too, unless you build something in to prevent it. The feeling of being moved is not the mechanism. It's just weather. It passes. What actually changes outcomes is repetition until something becomes automatic, because whatever gets repeated enough stops being a decision and becomes a rhythm. And a rhythm is no longer something you do. It's something that runs you. This is most of the explanation for why financial habits, good or bad, tend to be so sticky. Someone who's spent years thinking in terms of scarcity doesn't have to consciously choose scarcity thinking anymore. It's automatic. They see an opportunity, and before any real analysis happens, some older part of them has already explained why it isn't for them. They didn't choose that response. It was built through repetition, and now it runs on its own, which is why the sentence needs to be written down, not just thought. Read it out loud, morning and evening, so your own voice carries it back to you. There's something about hearing your own voice say a thing that lands differently than merely thinking it silently. So here's the full sentence, as promised. What will I give in return? How much? And by when? That's the entire distance between the fortune sitting in your head and the fortune that could exist in your hand. 10 seconds to say. Possibly the most expensive 10 seconds available to you, because almost nobody is willing to actually answer all three parts honestly. Tomorrow morning, if you actually write this down tonight, you'll probably notice a very reasonable sounding voice. It won't argue with any of what you just heard. It's too smart for that, and arguing gives you something to push back against. Instead, it will simply suggest gently, in a tone that sounds a lot like your own good judgment, that today isn't quite the ideal day to start, that you didn't sleep well, that there's a work thing to handle first, that the number you wrote down last night was a little hasty and deserves more careful thought before you commit to it. That voice isn't your judgment. It's the comfortable, familiar version of you that this exercise just threatened for the first time in years. And it will negotiate rather than fight, because negotiating works better on people who don't recognize it as a negotiation. Nobody has ever been ruined by starting with an imperfect plan. Plenty of people have spent entire decades being quietly ruined by planning to start tomorrow. The plan doesn't need to be good. It needs to exist with a number and a date attached, and it needs to survive contact with that first reasonable sounding morning. Take the paper. Write the number. Don't shrink it out of politeness, because timid requests don't seem to get rewarded any more than timid effort does. Write the date. Write what you're actually willing to give in exchange. Read it out loud before you sleep, and again before the world gets a chance to talk you out of it. You've been carrying a fortune in your head for a long time. It's worth nothing sitting there, and it always will be, until you finally ask it the one question most people spend a lifetime avoiding. What will you give? How much? And by when?